The illegal drugs war will not be sidelined. Instead, it will be as relentless and chilling, if you will, as on the day it began.
Was it really a victory for good government, Mr. Brown? Or was it a victory for propaganda?
That's quite a few ask her.
Well, we've been studying citizenship in school. In a few years, I'll start voting. I've been following the campaign. So much was said on both sides. I'm confused. How can you know what to believe when there's so much propaganda?
Perhaps I can help you, Chuck.
Harry Jacob Anslinger was born May 20, 1892 in Altoona, Pennsylvania. He attended Pennsylvania State College from 1913 to 1915. Anslinger served in the U.S. government, 1918 to 1963, under 9 presidents. He held consular posts in the Netherlands, Germany, Venezuela, and the Bahamas, 1918 to 1926. Treasury Department, Chief of Division of Foreign Control, 1926 to 1929, Assistant Commissioner of Prohibition, 1929 to 1930, and Commissioner, Bureau of Narcotics, 1930 to 1963. He was the U.S. representative at League of Nations conferences on narcotics, and served on the United Nations Narcotic Drugs Commission. Anslinger served for many years as the American government's chief law enforcement officer in the fight against illegal drugs. Anslinger was the commissioner of the Treasury Department's Bureau of Narcotics from its inception in 1930 until his retirement in 1963. He also authored several books in which he presented the story of police efforts to curb the import and use of dangerous drugs.
This is Harry J. Anslinger, Commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics.
The Treasury Department intends to pursue a relentless warfare against the despicable, dope-peddling vulture who preys on the weakness of his fellow man.
America's first drug czar was Harry J. Anslinger. A law and order evangelist, Anslinger would shape America's attitude toward marijuana for generations to come. Like many Americans, Anslinger was a prohibitionist. These morally correct citizens sincerely felt that progress could only be achieved by controlling the depraved impulses of the masses.
Swordfish.
He believed that if the laws were tough enough, America could be rid of alcohol. Put enough people in jail, and eventually the public will learn to behave. And he applied this same philosophy to mounting the government's war on drugs.
Special Treasury agents are part of a massive force created solely to control the traffic in narcotics.
You got any merchandise obtained in Canada or abroad? No. Have you any liquor? No. Get out of the car and let's take a look at it. Come on.
Move over, J. Edgar Hoover. Here come the agents of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics.
Like J. Edgar Hoover, Anslinger posed for the cameras, creating the impression he was smashing one major dope ring after another. But he found out pretty quickly that policing 48 states on a depression-strapped budget was impossible. His solution was to try to convince the states to police local drug traffic themselves. Campaigning tirelessly, he lobbied each state to sign a joint agreement to commit state resources to fighting drugs. But only 9 states signed on. The other 39 viewed it as federal interference in their affairs. It was a major defeat for the young drug commissioner, but he wasn't the type to give up. Meanwhile, marijuana, carried by West Indian sailors, arrived in port cities like New Orleans. Known as muggles, tea, or reefer, it was popular with the jazz crowd because it made music sound so good. From here, musicians carried it up the Mississippi to urban centers in the north.
Have you ever met that funny reefer man? Have you ever met that funny reefer man? If he says he swam to China, wants to sell you South Carolina, then you know you're talking to that reefer man. Have you ever met that funny reefer man? Oh, that funny, funny, funny reefer man. If he trades you dimes for nickels, he says watermelons are pickles. You know you talking to that reefer man. Or have you ever met that funny reefer man? Oh, that funny, funny, funny reefer man.
With marijuana showing up in the big cities, Anslinger realized it might be the answer to his problem. If he could persuade white America that marijuana was a deadly menace, frightened voters might push their state legislators to sign on to his Uniform Narcotics Act.
Why don't we do this more often? Why don't we? Just what we're doing tonight. What a lovely
Hemp was used to make products like cloth, rope, and sails from the moment the American colonies began. Early drafts of the Declaration of Independence were written on hemp paper, though the final version still preserved today is written on parchment. While smokable cannabis likely reached the United States in the early days of the 20th century, the common slang term marijuana reflects its likely origins as an import via Mexico. Cannabis tinctures were widely used in medicine for at least a century beforehand, even available in many drugstores. For a brief moment, Turkish smoking parlors were all the rage in American high society. Of course, all that changed with the beginning of the war on drugs. As alcohol prohibition ended, much of the same law enforcement apparatus that had targeted speakeasies and booze smuggling turned against cannabis in the 1930s. Even humble hemp was demonized for the cause of drug prohibition until, that is, the U.S. military faced a wartime shortage decades later during World War II. That's when the Department of Agriculture had an informational film released in 1943 called Hemp for Victory. The film was to encourage farmers to grow hemp and told of all the values of hemp.
long ago, when these ancient Grecian temples were new, hemp was already old in the service of mankind. For thousands of years even then, this plant had been grown for cordage and coarse cloth in China and elsewhere in the East. For centuries prior to about 1850, all the ships that sailed the western seas were rigged with hempen rope and sails. For the sailor, no less than the hangman, hemp was indispensable. A 44-gun frigate, like our cherished old Ironsides, took over 60 tons of hemp for rigging, including an anchor cable 25 inches in circumference. The Conestoga wagons and prairie schooners of pioneer days were covered with hempen canvas. Indeed, the very word canvas comes from the Arabic word for hemp. In those days, hemp was an important crop in Kentucky and Missouri. Then came cheaper imported fibers for cordage, like jute, sisal, and manila hemp, and the culture of hemp in America declined. But now, with Philippine and East Indian sources of hemp in the hands of the Japanese, and shipment of jute from India curtailed, American hemp must meet the needs of our Army and Navy as well as of our industries. In 1942, patriotic farmers at the government's request planted 36,000 acres of seed hemp, an increase of several thousand %. The goal for 1943 is 50,000 acres of seed hemp. In Kentucky, much of the seed hemp acreage is on river bottom land such as this, along the Kentucky River Gorge. Some of these fields are inaccessible except by boat. Thus, plans are afoot for a great expansion of the hemp industry as a part of the war program. This film is designed to tell farmers how to handle this ancient crop, now little known outside Kentucky and Wisconsin. This is hemp seed. Be careful how you use it. For to grow hemp legally, you must have a federal registration and tax stamp. This is provided for in your contract. Ask your AAA committeeman or your county agent about it. Don't forget, hemp demands a rich, well-drained soil such as is found here in the bluegrass region of Kentucky or in central Wisconsin. It must be loose and rich in organic matter. Poor soils won't do. Soil that will grow good corn will usually grow hemp. Hemp is not hard on the soil. In Kentucky, it has been grown for several years on the same ground, though this practice is not recommended. A dense and shady crop, hemp tends to choke out weeds. Here's a Canada thistle that couldn't stand the competition. Dead as a dodo. Thus, hemp leaves the ground in good condition for the following crop. For fiber, hemp should be sown 5 pecks to the acre. With drill, the closer the rows, the better. These rows are spaced about 4 inches. This hemp has been broadcast. Either way, it should be sown thick enough to grow a slender stalk. Here's an ideal stand. The right height to be harvested easily, thick enough to grow slender stalks that are easy to cut and process. Stalks like these here on the left, they yield the most fiber and the best. Those on the right are too coarse and woody. For seed, hemp is planted in hills like corn, sometimes by hand. Hemp is a dioecious plant. The female flower is inconspicuous, but the male flower is easily spotted. In seed production, after the pollen has been shed, these male plants are cut out. These are the seeds on a female plant. Hemp for fiber is ready to harvest when the pollen is shedding and the leaves are falling. In Kentucky, hemp harvest comes in August. Here, the old standby has been the self-rake reaper, which has been used for a generation or more. Hemp grows so luxuriantly in Kentucky that harvesting is sometimes difficult, which may account for the popularity of the self-rake with its lateral stroke. A modified rice binder has been used to some extent. This machine works well in average hemp. Recently, the improved hemp harvester, used for many years in Wisconsin, has been introduced in Kentucky. This machine spreads the hemp in a continuous swath. It is a far cry from this fast and efficient modern harvester to the Armstrong model of yore. But here's one kind of harvester, at least, that doesn't stall in the heaviest hemp. In Kentucky, hand cutting is practiced in opening fields for the machines. In Kentucky, hemp is shucked as soon as safe after cutting, to be spread out for retting later in the fall. In Wisconsin, hemp is harvested in September. Here, the hemp harvester with automatic spreader is standard equipment. Note how smoothly the rotating apron lays the swath preparatory to retting. Here it is a common and essential practice to leave headlands around hemp fields. These strips may be planted to other crops, preferably small grain. Thus, the harvester has room to make its first round without preparatory hand cutting. Here the machine is running over corn stubble. When the cutter bar is much shorter than the hemp is tall, overlapping occurs, not so good for retting. The standard cut is 8 to 9 feet. The length of time hemp is left on the ground to ret depends on the weather. The swaths must be turned to get a uniform ret. When the woody core breaks away readily, like this, the hemp is about ready to take up and bind into bundles. Well-retted hemp is light to dark gray. The fiber tends to pull away from the stalk. The presence of stalks in the bowstring stage indicates that retting is well underway. When hemp is short or tangled, or when the ground is too wet for machines, it is bound by hand. A wooden buck is used. Twine will do for tying, but the hemp itself makes a good band. When conditions are favorable, the pickup binder is commonly used. The swaths should lie smooth and even with stalks parallel. The picker won't work well in tangled hemp. After binding, hemp is shucked as soon as possible to stop further retting. In 1942, 14,000 acres of fiber hemp were harvested in the United States. The goal for 1943 is 300,000 acres. Thus, hemp, Cannabis sativa, the old standby cordage fiber, is staging a strong comeback. This is Kentucky hemp going into the dryer of a mill at Versailles. In the old days, breaking was done by hand, one of the hardest jobs known to man. Now the power breaker makes quick work of it. Spinning American hemp into rope yarn or twine in the old Kentucky River Mill at Frankfort, Kentucky. Another pioneer plant that has been making cordage for more than a century. such plants will presently be turning out products spun from American-grown hemp. Twine of various kinds for tying, winding armatures, and upholsterers' work. Rope for marine rigging and towing, for hay forks, derricks, and heavy-duty tackle. Light-duty fire hose. Thread for shoes for millions of American soldiers. And parachute webbing for our paratroopers. As for the United States Navy, every battleship requires 34,000 feet of rope, and other craft accordingly. So here in the Boston Navy Yard, where cables for frigates were made long ago, crews are now working night and day making cordage for the fleet. In the old days, rope yarn was spun by hand. Today, even the rope walk is mechanized. 160 fathoms to go. The rope yarn feeds through holes in an iron plate. This is Manila hemp from the Navy's rapidly dwindling reserve. When that is gone, American hemp will go on duty again. Hemp for mooring ships, hemp for tow lines. Hemp for tackle and gear. Hemp for countless naval uses, both on ship and shore. Just as in the days when old Ironside sailed the seas victorious, with her hempen shrouds and hempen sails. Hemp for victory.
You can take the moon, gather up the stars and the robins that sing merrily.
Not only was Harry the founding commissioner of the Treasury's Federal Bureau of Narcotics, he was also a blatant racist, and this trait infused into propaganda pushed the anti-marijuana agenda into full swing. He was able to do this because he was tapping into very deep anxieties in the culture that had nothing to do with drugs. The word marijuana itself was part of this approach. What was commonly known as cannabis until the early 1900s was instead called marihuana, a Spanish word more likely to be associated with Mexicans and attaching them to this drug, essentially. In 1930s America, it wasn't hard to use racist rhetoric to associate the supposed harms of cannabis with minorities and immigrants. In 1937, U.S. Narcotics Commissioner Henry Anslinger testified before Congress in the hearings that would result in the introduction of federal restrictions on marijuana. Anslinger's testimony included a letter from Floyd Baskett, the city editor of the Alamosa Daily Courier, which said in part, "I wish I could show you what a small marijuana cigarette can do to one of our degenerate Spanish-speaking residents. That's why our problem is so great. The greatest percentage of our population is composed of Spanish-speaking persons. Most of you are low mentally, because of social and racial conditions." Anslinger also claimed that black people and Latinos were the primary users of marijuana, and it also makes darkies think they're as good as white men. making them forget their place in the fabric of American society. He even went so far as to argue that jazz musicians were creating satanic music all thanks to the influence of marijuana. Anslinger feared jazz. He said that jazz sounded like the jungle in the middle of the night and that colored men with big lips used jazz and marijuana to lure white women. This obsession eventually led to a sort of witch hunt against black musicians, including Dizzy Gillespie, Louis Armstrong, who was arrested and smeared by the press, and legendary singer Billie Holiday, who struggled with heroin addiction. She lost her license to perform in New York cabarets and continued to be dogged by law enforcement until her death. Fueled by a handful of 1920s newspaper stories about crazed or violent episodes after marijuana use, Anslinger first claimed that the drug could cause psychosis and eventually insanity. In a radio address, he stated young people are slaves to this narcotic, continuing addiction until they deteriorate mentally, become insane, turn to violent crime and murder. In particular, he latched on to the story of a young man named Victor Licata, who had hacked his family to death with an axe, supposedly while high on cannabis. It was discovered many years later, however, that Licata had a history of mental illness in his family, and there was no proof he ever used the drug. The problem was, there was little scientific evidence that supported Anslinger's claims, and he cherry-picked theories that bolstered his agenda. He contacted 30 scientists and 29 told him cannabis was not a dangerous drug. But it was the theory of the single expert who agreed with him that he presented to the public cannabis was an evil that should be banned, and the press ran with this sensationalized version.